Hello everyone, my name is JodianSR. Today I'll be speaking about Trump, President of the United States, et al. V. Barbara. This case will particularly be looking at birthright citizenship and the constitutional limits of executive power. The United States Supreme Court, as discussed in our previous classes, is the highest court in the United States, and its decisions are final, binding, and binding on all lower federal and state courts. This presentation concerned the case, as I had mentioned earlier, of Trump v. Barbara as one of the most significant constitutional cases of the court's 25-26 term because it addresses the scope of citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment and the limits of presidential authority over the long discussed birthright citizens. So the objective of this presentation is to trace the journey throughout the federal judicial system from the executive order to the Supreme Court and remand, to explain the constitutional and legal issues presented in this case, to summarize the Supreme Court's ruling and the legal reasoning, to evaluate the significance of this decision, and to discuss its impact on executive authority, birthright citizenship, and future of constitutional litigation. Looking at the background or the background facts of this case is that on January 20, 2025, President Donald J. Trump signed Executive Order 14160 entitled Protecting the Meaning and Value of American Citizenship. The order stated that children born in the United States whose parents were unlawfully present or temporarily present would not automatically receive United States citizenship. So the background continued to say that based on this administration, it argued that these children were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, which is a language found in the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. As a result of this executive order, this order gave federal agencies the authority to deny recognition of United States citizenship to children born in the States if at the time of the child's birth, the mother was either unlawfully present or temporarily within the country and the father was neither a United States citizen or permanent resident. This order was scheduled to be enforceable 30 days after issuance and instructed that federal agencies revise their policies and procedures to reflect the newly implemented citizenship standards that were clearly highlighted in the executive order. Since the Supreme Court's landmark decision in United States v. Wong Kim Ark, the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment, it was a legal understanding that is generally addressing persons born on United States soil, regardless of the immigration status of their parents. However, it did come with exemption. The first exemption was children of diplomats. And children of diplomats have been deemed not to be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and therefore not United States citizens under the 14th Amendment. Child or children born to soldiers considered enemy invaders was the second exemption. This was so because during an hostile occupation of the United States, they could not be considered subject to the United States, hence they were excluded from birthright citizenship. And finally, in the recent decision of Fitzimo v. United States, it ruled that unlike Americans born in incorporated United States territories, those born in unincorporated territories of America Samoa are not entitled to birthright citizenship without the act of Congress creating that right. They were considered non-citizen national. So taking that into consideration, the exemptment and everything that was happening, legal scholars, immigration professionals, and constitutional law experts and other interest groups argued that the president could not alter the meaning of the 14th Amendment through an executive order. Instead, it was argued that this was only possible through the procedural process, which would either require either a constitutional amendment or a new interpretation by the Supreme Court, as the executive order exceeded the presidential authority and conflicted with established precedents. It was argued by plaintiffs that this implementation of this order would cause immediate and irreparable harm to families, newborn babies, healthcare providers, and state governments responsible for issuing public service and vital records. So, because of that, several parents, several immigration professionals, several constitutional law experts filed suits against the federal government. They argue that the executive order violated one, the 14th Amendment, and two, the the Immigration and Nationality Act, that is code the 8th United States Code, subsection 1401, subsection A, because children born in the United States have always been recognized as citizens regardless of their parents' immigration status. So while looking at that, then we can see that the executive order was signed and then a suit happened. So we can look at the case's journey's path through the federal court system. While looking at the case journey, first, as I had said earlier, it's began with litigation on January 20, 2025, when President Trump issued Executive Order 14160, protecting the means and values of American citizens. As I had stated earlier, the order directed federal agencies to deny automatic U.S. citizenship to certain children born in the United States if their parents were unlawfully present or only temporarily present in the country. The administration argued that these children were not subject to jurisdiction of the United States with the meaning of the 14th Amendment. This order was issued by the authority of the executive branch, as they were the one who acted through the President of the United States. As a result, the legal issue that arose was constitutional questions about whether or not a president, through the executive order, may interpret the Constitution that speaks to the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment and the corresponding provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act. So why did this case move to the next level? The case subsequently moved to the next level because the executive order had not taken effect as yet, but it threatened to deny citizenship to children who would have been recognized as United States citizens. Unaffected families sought immediate judicial intervention. As a result, the plaintiffs in Trump versus Barbara, which included Barbara, as we had stated, and a plethora of other individuals and organizations, they believe that they needed to file that constitutional right, file suit requesting a preliminary injunction to prevent the enforcement of order with the constitutional issues that were being litigated. So that was phase one. Phase two was the federal district court. The federal district court occurred when the plaintiff filed a suit in the United States District Court for the District of New Hampshire, as they argued that the executive order violated, as I said, both the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment and the Immigration and Nationality Act. After reviewing the case, the district court agreed with the plaintiffs, as they were likely to succeed because the executive order appeared to conflict with the 14th Amendment and the Supreme Court precedents that protects birthright citizens. So the legal issues that were before the court, as the District of New Hampshire heard the case, the district considered the executive order likely violated the 14th Amendment. That's the first thing. Second, the plaintiffs were likely to succeed on the merits of their argument. Third, the plaintiffs would suffer irreparable harm without an injunction, the preliminary injunction served public interest. As a result, the federal government opposed the preliminary injunction because it prevented nationwide implementation of the executive order. Thus, instead of waiting for the ordinary appellate process to conclude, the government sought immediate Supreme Court review due to the importance of the case. So it moved from the the federal district court, to the appeal process. The federal government filed a notice of appeal to the United States Court of Appeal for the First Circuit, challenging the district court's preliminary injunction. However, before the First Circuit issued a decision, the government petitioned to the Supreme Court to hear the case directly. This was so because the legal issue was before the appellate court was whether the district court properly issued the preliminary injunction and whether the executive order was consistent with the Constitution and federal law. Because the case had disputes that involved major constitutional questioning affecting citizenship nationwide, the government asked the Supreme Court to bypass the ordinary or the normal appellate process. So, rather than willing to wait for the First Circuit to decide the appeal, the federal government files a petition for a writ of certiorari. This is an extraordinary procedure that allows the Supreme Court to review cases directly from the district court before the Court of Appeal has entered a final decision. This was approved by the Supreme Court on December 5th, 2025, as we can see on our timeline chart, recognizing that the case presented was of extreme importance to the constitutional issue, thus requiring prompt attention to the legal matter. It continued with stage 5, where the Supreme Court on April 1st, 2026, heard the oral arguments and issued a decision. After hearing the oral arguments and contemplating and doing what they do, a decision was issued on June 30th, 2026. The Supreme Court held that children born in the United States to parents who are unlawfully or temporarily present are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and therefore are considered citizens at birth under the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. In reaching this conclusion, the majority rely on historical understanding of the Citizenship Clause and the repudiation of Dre Scott v. Stanford and the precedent established in the United States v. Wong Kim Ark. The decision was particularly significant because the Supreme Court definitively resolved the constitutional dispute, affirming that birthright citizenship extend to these children and rejected the executive order narrow interpretation of the Citizenship Clause. It was then remanded. So the case was remanded. After affirming the district court's judgment, the Supreme Court returned the case to the district court for additional proceedings that were consistent with its opinion. Because the Supreme Court upheld the preliminary injunction and concluded that the executive order conflicted with the 14th Amendment, the order was therefore not enforceable. The case was remanded by the United States District Court for the District of New Hampshire. On remand, the lower court's role was to implement the Supreme Court's ruling and oversee any remaining proceedings consistent with the court's constitutional interpretation. The Supreme Court had resolved their central constitutional issues, thus leaving the district court to apply the decision made. It is very important for us to understand the importance of the remand stage. The case being remanded is important because it shows that the Supreme Court's decision do not always conclude litigation. Instead, the Supreme Court often provides the controlling legal rule that the lower courts must follow in resolving the issues at hand. This reinforces that the Supreme Court is a final interpreter of the Constitution. Based on that, we can look into the majority opinion that was presented. Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. wrote in the majority opinion, the court held the Citizenship Clause protects nearly everyone born on the U.S. soil. The phrase "subject to the jurisdiction thereof" does not exclude children simply because their parents were undocumented or temporarily present. It also stated that the court heavily relied on the text of the 14th Amendment, the historical understanding, more than a century of constitutional precedent, including the United States v. Wong Kim Act. Why the court rejected the executive order is because the majority concluded that the president cannot redefine the constitutional citizenship by executive order. Constitutional rights cannot be changed by an executive action. And finally, only a constitutional amendment or legislation consistent with the Constitution can alter constitutional right. Therefore, the Executive Order 14160 was an unconstitutional order. Why does this case matter? Overall, while understanding and examining this case, Trump v. Barbara, it's important to us to understand it is because it reinforces judicial review. It also highlights the limited power, executive presidential power. It highlights the protection of the constitutional rights. It reaffirmed the meaning of the 14th Amendment. It strengthens the precedent established before than a century ago, and it demonstrates that the Supreme Court role is as the final interpreter of the Constitution. I also decided to do the IRA analysis on this case. So the IRA analysis on Trump v. Barbara is first the issue. Can the president deny birthright citizenship by executive order? What's the rule? The 14th Amendment's Citizenship Clause and the Immigration and Nationality Act govern birthright citizenship. The application is that the court interpreted the phrase "subject to jurisdiction thereof", examined historical context, and applied long-standing precedent, particularly United States v. Wong Kim Act, and the conclusion that was held is that the executive order was held invalid because it conflicted with the Constitution and the federal law. While looking at Trump v. Barbara, this shows that this case was an interlocutory appeal because it occurred before the district court entered the final judgment. The Supreme Court reviewed the preliminary injunction while the case was still pending. In conclusion, I believe that this case demonstrates that while the president possesses broad executive authority, the authority is limited by the Constitution. The Supreme Court in this case reaffirmed that constitutional rights cannot be modified through executive actions alone. The decision also illustrates the importance of judicial review and the system of checks and balances established in and by the Constitution. Thank you so much for listening to my case. I have also included the authorities that I cited, the references that I cited for your further reading. Enjoy the rest of your day. It was nice presenting on Trump v. Barbara.